All right, hello everyone. My name is Ashwin Sivakumar. I am an undergraduate at Harvard University working in the Edwards Lab at the Museum of Comparative Zoology. And today I want to pitch a talk to you all as conservation folks that is actually might not at first glance seem like a conservation talk. This might seem like more of an evolution or sort of a morphology talk, but I want to make a case for museum collections and the study of morphology in museum collections as actually an invaluable conservation resource as we're trying to understand global change and how it affects birds. You might also be confused by the species here, the song sparrow, one of our most widespread and common birds being the center of a conservation talk. But as you'll soon see, the story is more complicated than that. What just happened? Right. Oh, there we go. Okay, so migratory behavior is obviously extremely important to about half of our birds in North America, a solid third to a half globally. Migratory behavior, of course, is not a single trait, but rather an agglomeration of dozens and dozens of different traits. The distance travel, departure and arrival times, behavioral traits like that, as well as physiological and morphological traits such as wing morphology, which is what I'm going to be talking about, lipid fluxes, the ability to atrophy organs. There's a lot of traits that are looped into what's called the migratory syndrome. And what's perplexing about that is despite the complexity of this migratory trait, in response to recent global change, we've seen the incredible, spectacular ability for migration to evolve on the scale of just generations. So the famous example of this is from blackcaps in the United Kingdom, which have started wintering in the United Kingdom. They're birds from Central Europe that have completely changed their route to go in almost the opposite direction they normally do. They now fly northwest and winter in the United Kingdom. And this only happened over the past 50 years or so. And there's tons of examples like this, including some from North America. So there's a bit of a paradox. Migratory behavior is incredibly complex. So what allows it to change so quickly in response to change, despite its complexity? And in certain situations when it doesn't change so quickly, why is that the case? So the song sparrow is a species that is, as you'll soon see, both migratory and non-migratory, depending on which population you're talking about, which individuals you're talking about. And it's a species that actually, despite its abundance today, is expected to undergo, and it has undergone within the last few decades, incredible change. So on the right, you can see the eBird status and trends model from the past 50 or so years. And you can see that there's been dramatic loss of song sparrow populations in most of the areas of highest population density, including the West Coast and the Midwest. And there's been some areas of gain as well, but there's been an overall decline. And on the left here is the Audubon survival by degrees report, which projects due to climate change over the next, there's about a 2-degree warming scenario, loss of song sparrow distribution from a lot of the Midwest and the Intermountain West as well. So, the species is projected to experience major change and is experiencing major change. But one thing this belies is the fact that if the song sparrow is not one population, it might not even be one species. It's in fact an array of 24-ish different subspecies, some of which shown in orange are migratory or partially migratory, and some of which shown in green are actually non-migratory. There's incredible variation in migratory behavior within the species. Birds from Quebec might be migrating over 4,000 kilometers annually. That's from the nominate subspecies, while in the San Francisco Bay, you have these salt marsh specialists, which are hyper-sedentary. They never leave their natal patch throughout their entire life. And actually, in the New England area, we're mostly dealing with this dominant subspecies, partially migratory, but not too far from here, starting on Long Island and then going all the way down the Atlantic coast to Georgia. We have this salt marsh specialist subspecies, Atlantica, which uses which although it is migratory, is actually a very habitat and site specific specialist. So it'll be interesting to see how this species modifies both its migratory behavior and its distribution in response to climate change, sea level rise. It faces a lot of the same threats as, salt marsh sparrows and seaside sparrows and other salt marsh specialists. So the question that's central to what I'm interested in is how will diverse migratory and sedentary subspecies across the range of this species respond to rapid change in the future? So one of the most important traits that mediates the ability of species to respond to this kind of anthropogenic change is their morphology. And one of the most important aspects of morphology for most birds is what's known as the hand-wing index, which is essentially the ratio between the length of the primary feathers to that of the secondary feathers, normalized by the total wing length. Basically, how long is your wing relative to how narrow your wing is. And, migratory birds, there's a wood swallow here, there's a vanus on the left, and migratory birds have, consistently been shown, this is one of the most well-established relationships in ecomorphology. Migratory birds have a longer hand-wing index than non-migratory birds do, and this goes all the way down to the subspecific level. It's a very, very responsive trait to migratory behavior, and we know it's key to migratory adaptation. The question is, how evolvable is this trait? Because if this trait is not evolvable, that's going to gatekeep birds' ability to respond wholesale if they need to global change and to modify their migratory behavior. This will be the limiting factor. Now I'm going to go into a little bit of sort of evolutionary theory, but I promise it does apply to conservation, because there are two primary factors that affect any trait, its ability to respond to change rapidly. And one of those is what's called the modularity of the trait, which is essentially how if you have a trait that has a bunch of different components, do those components all have the ability to sort of vary independently? And thus, like, for each individual component, for example, this is a spinal column, is there like one gene controlling that component? And in that case, it's very, very easy to evolve these traits, because all you need to do is to change this one gene, and then this one component will just change in response to that. Versus, as is the case with a lot of traits that are massively polygenic, such as like height in humans, is evolution not so modular? Are there actually lots of complex interacting gene networks and relationships that control an individual trait? And in that case, you can expect that there's a lower degree of evolvability, and different components of the same trait will be more closely tied to each other, and thus the overall trait will be more difficult to evolve rapidly. So modularity is one big factor that affects what we call evolvability, or the ability of a trait to respond rapidly to change. Yeah. So hand-wing index, I'm going to return to hand-wing index for a second. I don't know if any of you were here for Lisa's talk right before lunch, but shorebirds especially have experienced a lot of dramatic change over the past 50 to 100 years. And one aspect of that change that's really interesting has actually been the return of peregrine falcons and other aerial predators to the landscape. And there's been a lot of work on hand-wing index in sandpipers. And interestingly, we've actually seen firsthand shifts in hand-wing index in sandpipers over the past 40 years or so. And it's been a shift in response to peregrine activity. We think these shifts allow birds to turn and maneuver in flight more efficiently. Interestingly, we've seen an opposite trend in hand-wing index in semi-palmated sandpipers and western sandpipers. They seem to be actually sort of converging in their hand-wing indices. But the interesting aspect here is that hand-wing index has changed very rapidly for both of these species. This seems to be a very evolvable trait. We've seen response just within our own lifetimes in response to an event of change. And one thing that allows this change to happen, or we think allows this change to happen so rapidly, is the second thing, in addition to modularity, that facilitates evolvability, and that is standing variation. So, as you can see, both in the 80s and 90s in semi-palmated and western sandpipers, there's a lot of variation in hand-wing index, and that variation produces or creates the material upon which evolution can act. If you have some individuals that are already longer winged, those individuals can be selected and the trait can change very rapidly, as opposed to, if you have more uniformity in the trait at the beginning, you're not going to have the material necessary for evolution to, drive that change. You're going to have novel mutations happen, which slows down the ability of the trait to respond. So we think that this is the second factor, standing variation, that's very important to look at in any trait that's changing rapidly. And so we're interested in both of these questions as they apply to the avian wing. We're interested in what's called allometry, which is, how do these various components of the wing, the feathers and the various bones in the wing, respond differentially, to as the overall trait. We know that the overall trait increases reliably whenever migration evolves. The question is, how modular is that change? Do the different components sort of have the ability to respond differently to each other? Is there modularity, or is it, a super, tied up and complicated trait that doesn't have the ability to evolve? So that isn't so evolvable. Another thing that affects that is how much variation was there, at the beginning of this change period in these traits, like how much standing variation was there. And so those are the two questions that I was really interested in. So yeah, the overall goal of this project was to assess how evolvable is migration across the distribution of this incredibly diverse species. So there are like three main stages to this. The first is looking at how wing morphology varies within and between subspecies of song sparrow, and specifically, is standing variation within the species enough to facilitate this rapid process of adaptation. The second is to assess what components are driving this variation in overall wing morphology. And that the ultimate question there is how labile or how flexible is this hand-wing index trait? How modular is the control of that trait, and how easily can it actually evolve? And then finally, the question is, across these independently evolved migratory subspecies, are the components that drive variation the same or different across these subspecies? And so, by extension, does the ability to respond to change actually vary across the species' range? And could that result in different outcomes for different subspecies that have the same migratory strategy? So to do this, my strategy to doing this, or at least working towards assessing these questions, was to create a large historical data set of song sparrow wing morphology at a certain reference point in the past. This is not so important. This is sort of the seasonal distribution of the specimens. What's more important is this, which is the distribution between 1850 and the present day of the birds in this database. These are all birds from Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology. I hand measured about 307 or exactly 307 of them from almost exclusively, there are a few specimens towards the end there and a few earlier, but almost all of the specimens came from between 1870 and 1940. So what this allows us to do is actually create this historical benchmark data set for this species, across the species distribution at a certain window in history, about 100 years ago, to which, this is outside the scope of what I was doing, but to which modern birds that are measured, in banding operations and other projects. Banding has only really been going on actively for the past 60 or 70 years, but this database from over 100 years ago can be compared to modern banding records to try to understand how, wing morphology has changed during that period of time. There's a pretty wide spread to the distribution of these specimens. A lot of them, there's some from New England, in Maine, and especially in Nova Scotia, there's a bunch from there, but a lot from, Alaska, the West Coast, the Southwest, pretty much across the distribution of the species, representing about 60 different subspecies. And what we find, so the first thing we're interested in is at this point in history, 100 years ago, how much standing variation was there in this hand-wing index trait? And that will have an effect on how evolvable the trait is, how much variation there is for evolution to have acted upon over the past 100 years. And what we find is that although hand-wing index is significantly elevated in both Eastern migrant and Western migrant populations relative to all these sedentary populations, there's a huge amount of standing variation, both in sedentary and migratory populations. So even in the Aleutian population of song sparrows, which we think are perhaps almost flightless. Like these birds are hyper sedentary. They're found on the outer Aleutian Islands in Alaska. There's a huge amount of variation in hand wing index, with some birds, having hand wing indices that are almost the same as the median among the eastern migrant birds and the western migrant birds. So, there are sedentary birds that have wings that are almost as long or even as long as your typical migratory bird. And there are migratory birds that have shorter wings as well. So the first question is sort of answered, yes, there is a huge amount of standing variation, and that may have facilitated, rapid adaptation in this trait over the past 100 years. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but basically I CT scanned a small proportion of the birds, about 30 of them, so about a tenth of the birds. It's a time-intensive process, but basically we're able to extract really, really precise CT scans of wing morphology for these birds, and it's a distribution of them from across the range of the species. And we're able to basically pull a few precise morphometrics out of the wing. So those included the length of 3 different bones in the wing, as well as the length of the outermost primary feather. And these are much more precise measurements than we can get from hand measurements of hand wing indexes typically done. These are down to like 50 micron resolution. And so we looked at all of these different, components of the wing. And here we're trying to address that second major determinant of evolvability, which is modularity. And we looked at the 2 bones in the wing, and we find that these basically contribute nothing to hand wing index. These slopes are basically flat. They basically have no relationship to hand wing index. The thing that really matters is that outermost primary feather. This feather is driving hand wing index overwhelmingly. It's the only component of the wing that has a significant association with hand wing index. So it seems like the feather is specifically, the outermost primary feather is specifically the component of the wing that is most important for hand wing index. And the conclusion from that is that hand wing index is actually an incredibly modular trait. It's a trait where one specific component and the genetic control of that component is essentially entirely responsible for the whole trait, which means that this is actually an incredibly evolvable trait. It doesn't require coordination among the genes involved in bone and feather morphogenesis. So, the takeaways I'll quickly run through. We measured hand wing index on over 300 birds from most subspecies across the distribution of the song sparrow. And we obtained these high resolution CT scans from about a tenth of them. And in doing so, we built the largest existing intraspecies data set of avian wing morphology at this resolution. So from banding data, we have a lot of data on hand wing index, but this is the biggest data set of wing morphology where we're actually piecing apart the different components of the wing and into individual bones and feathers. And importantly, this creates a data set of incredible historical value, because this data set is almost entirely from this period in the past 100 years ago, and it can serve as a reference point for assessing morphological change over the past century in a way that studies haven't really done before. Our ability to assess hand wing index up to this point has basically encompassed the last 50 or 60 years in which we have banding data. The conclusions are that migratory populations have a higher hand wing index than sedentary ones, but with extensive overlap, which indicates a high degree of standing variation in all populations that allows this change to sort of rapidly occur. We find that one primary feather specifically contributes disproportionately to this wing lengthening process versus the bone lengths in the wing, which comprise the majority of the length of the actual wing, are mostly conserved. Which means that hand wing index evolution is relatively modular as well. And this, together with the degree of standing variation in this trait, helps explain why hand wing index is so evolvable, and may also just explain why migration as a whole is so evolvable. And this relationship, I didn't really touch on this, but feel free to ask me about it. This relationship holds across the geographic range of the species for the various independently evolved migratory subspecies. Whether you look at the Western migratory populations or the Eastern migratory populations, these results are the same, which indicates that we expect that the various migratory populations will have a similar capacity, at least in terms of morphology. We don't know about their habitat preferences and so forth, but they'll have a similar capacity morphologically to respond to change and change their migratory behavior. Morphology is not likely to be a limiting factor in change. There's a lot of work to be done because their effective sizes are still relatively low. There's probably unaccounted variables. a foot. I didn't measure the secondary feathers or distances between feather attachment points, but that's all going to be future work. We're working on expanding this data set to all populations across the species. There's a few we have left. We actually need to increase your sampling in New England specifically. We're going to CT scan a larger proportion of those birds that we've already measured. This is going to happen over the summer, but we're going to conduct some genomic analysis of these birds to try and figure out, what the actual genetic associates of that feather lengthening are. And we're also going to cross-reference our historical data set with modern, banding records, which is a little difficult to do for a number of reasons, but we're going to take a crack at it and see if we can figure out how this species has responded to migration, to global change over the last 100 years. I'd like to acknowledge all these people, especially Scott Edwards, whose lab this was done whose lab this was done entirely within, as well as Jeremiah Trimble, who's an incredibly close collaborator for all of this and helped procure and acquire all the specimens and CT scanning, et cetera. And with that, yeah, I know I'm over time, but I'll take any questions now.